I am in the Panjshir Valley. The reports concerning my escape from Afghanistan are totally baseless. I am here. We have had several meetings regarding the situation, no doubt. The situation is difficult. We have been under invasion of the Taliban, their Al-Qaeda allies, terrorist groups from the region and beyond.
ما آرزو داریم که این بار بعد از خاتمه اشغال افغانستان کاملا لانه امن، ثبات و آبادی باشد.
They are of the view that yes, there is seemingly quite a control that has been taken over by the Taliban in Panjshir Valley, and it will be for the first time that Northern Alliance control has gone vanished from the valley, and there will be a proper governance and law and order by the Afghan government and under the rule of Talib forces.
Hello and welcome to Newswire. I am Munib Hamid. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the Panjshir Valley in the Hindu Kush Mountains north of the Afghan capital Kabul has long been the heart of military resistance in Afghanistan and looks like it is becoming the center of a gathering of resistance forces against Taliban rule. Now, since mid-August, forces opposed to the rule of the Afghan Taliban have gathered in the valley under the leadership of Ahmad Massoud, son of the famed Afghan resistance fighter Ahmad Shah Massoud. Now, Panjshir is a long, narrow valley graded on the other side of the steep mountains with only one major point of exit and entry when approaching from Kabul. Topography that makes it difficult to conquer because incoming militaries are forced to approach through a narrow gorge. Now, the valley's name translates to basically 5 lines, although other translations claim its name may refer to 5 mountain peaks located down the length of the valley. Taliban forces remained unable to dislodge the Northern Alliance from its Panjshir stronghold until 2001, when Massoud was assassinated in a targeted suicide attack in Takeover province, just 2 days before the 9/11 attacks on the US. Now, the ensuing US invasion removed the group from power. 20 years later, as US and NATO forces withdrew from the country following a peace deal between the former and the Taliban, its forces swept across Afghanistan, capturing 33 out of 34 provinces in a lightning offensive over several weeks. Now, the one province that remains outside of their control is Panjshir. Until today, history has been made. The valley has been conquered by the Taliban successfully. Now, to talk on this, we have with us Dr. Salma Malik, defense analyst, and joining us is Dr. Meirowitz, political analyst. Now, I'm going to start with Dr. Salma now. We have a statement of a presser of Zabiullah Mujahid, the spokesperson of the Taliban. Now, he said today that a new Afghan government will be announced in the next few days after confirming that the group has taken over Panjshir, the only province that had remained out of the Taliban control. Also, declaring that the war in Afghanistan is over, Zabiullah Mujahid said Afghanistan might form a caretaker government. Please explain to us, what does he mean by a caretaker government?
I guess Zabiullah Massoud is pointing out towards the ultimate formation of the inclusive government, because you have some Afghan factions which previously were not part of the Taliban setup who are supporting him. So this particular effort by the Taliban to show an inclusivity in governance might be the hint that is being given out here. And so far what we have seen is an attempt by the Taliban to try and play as responsible political actors and try to defy all the previous associations that were held with them, that they are non-democratic forces, they are not willing to negotiate with other stakeholders in the picture, and they don't want to have a peaceful negotiation or a peaceful settlement or lead to a peaceful governance setup. So I suppose this time long the Taliban 2.0, as we tend to call them, are trying their level best to show to the world audience that they not only believe in inclusivity, they also believe in having a range of actors join them in the ultimate form of governance, plus the fact they are trying to also ease the discomfort level of the local people. Even when they took over the 8 districts of Panjshir Valley, the message that they gave to the people was that the brave people of Panjshir Valley should not be afraid and they should feel secure, no one is going to be hurt, etc. So keeping these things in mind, one feels that they're trying to look across for the international audience as a very responsible actor who are willing to take things purely on a good governance, democratic norms, and pacifist means. So I would translate it this way.
Right, Mark, the same question to you. What does the Taliban mean by imposing a caretaker government? Now, we already know that they are agreeing to forming an inclusive government now, but this statement has come out declaring that the war in Afghanistan is over. Zabiullah Mujahid said Afghanistan might form a caretaker government.
Well, I'm going to give you the American point of view on this. And when we think of words like inclusive and stability and new government and good governance, we think about free and fair elections and the right of the people and the consent of the governed to a government. That is absent here, 1,000%. It is insufficient to announce that I'm going to set up a government now and I'm going to decide who they are. I mean, that just doesn't fly, at least from the Western perspective and the American perspective. I think that what the Taliban should do is, create something miraculous in the world and, really stop all of this aggression, which they took the country by aggression, took over the country, and that's the American point of view. I mean, the American point of view is also looking at the losses of our soldiers and the Afghans who are the friends of the United States. Those Americans are still there, and those friends, the Afghan friends, are still there. So we can't get to Taliban 2 point whatever or 1 point whatever until we resolve these issues, and these issues are very important. Also, the people are starving, and I think 90% of the Afghan people live in poverty. Now the Taliban, now they have conquered by aggression, and now they have the job to fix everything. And I don't think they're able to do it, to be very candid. They've been calling back all the government workers to come back to work because they can't run things. So if they want to move forward in a democracy, in a free society where everybody has the right to express themselves, that includes having working women in universities, having freedom and equality for everyone, that would be the way. If you ask an American how you do that, that's how it's done. If they don't want to do that, then they will lack legitimacy in the world community. And I think they want that legitimacy, but how you get that is by pursuing democratic goals.
I mean, Mark, it is a difficult situation for the Taliban. Obviously, they have extensive experience in military power and conquering forces. We know that. Now, running the government is going to be a bit different for them, and it is going to be a bit difficult for them. But do you think that, obviously, the United States also could not achieve what it wanted to achieve in Afghanistan? And we also have a statement here by the US Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, which she has told BBC that he believes American troops will be going back into Afghanistan in the near future. What do you make up of that?
I mean, I think that Lindsey Graham is certainly a very influential voice on the Republican side. But we also have to listen to Mike McCall, who I think it was ambassador, who said that the situation in Afghanistan now is more severe and worse than it was prior to 9/11. Now, will President Biden, after withdrawing the troops, put troops back in? I mean, I think that this is a complete imponderable. I don't know about that right now. I only know the most immediate issue is to help the Afghani people and also evacuate American citizens and getting the friends of Americans, Afghanis out. And that was curtailed and stopped because of the August 31 deadline, which is absolutely controversial in this country and has affected Biden's standing in this country. If you're looking at politics, that's the American political point of view on this. So I think that we can't get to the next point until we see where we go in terms of what you've been talking about, which is kind of in this chess game, the Taliban has the next move. We'll let them make some good moves, get some legitimacy in the international community, and we move on from there. And I think that would be very good. Honestly, that would be very good. That would be the glass of water being half full and not half empty or completely shattered, which is where it looks like right now.
Right, Salma, now let's have you into this debate now. The Taliban have the ball in their court, and the next move is theirs to choose now. And firstly, I'll ask you to comment on Mark's analysis and his views about the questions, and then I'll ask you another question about Amrullah Saleh, who has fled to Tajikistan, and he is there to organize a site for negotiations with the Taliban.
Yeah, Munib, it's a bit fascinating to see how now the Taliban are being considered to run over Afghanistan and doing a lot of things. Wasn't this the writing on the wall since Doha? The way the agreement was signed separately with the Taliban and separately with the Afghan government already showed that these two stakeholders were being looked upon separately, differently by the US and the Western powers, and the US had already decided that the future stakeholder, the major stakeholder in Afghanistan is going to be the Taliban. And since Doha's signing till 15th of August, most of the actions that have taken place in Afghanistan, including how President Ghani was being looked upon by the various internal as well as external stakeholders, also showed the fact that he was the biggest impediment in any better developments happening in Afghanistan. So already the legitimacy as well as the credibility of the non-Taliban forces was being undermined. So today when the Western powers come in, they say that, oh, the Taliban have taken over, they have run over Afghanistan. What were you thinking when you were signing the Doha agreement? That was the writing on the wall. And if anyone feels the Taliban's sudden coming over, as the Australian Defence Forces chief mentioned that this was a cascading effect, is a surprise, then I think major powers had a major disconnect in their cognition of what was happening on ground in Afghanistan. And if after 20 years no one really read the writing on the wall, this is actually very, very traumatic and upsetting, because no one really bothered that after signing of the Doha, which was a flawed agreement, these things are going to happen very naturally. And that's precisely how the events unfolded. Yes, perhaps people were counting that the Taliban might take another week or 10 days before entering Kabul, and that they didn't do, and they entered when they did. That's the only surprise factor that one should factor in. Otherwise, what has happened is exactly what had to happen after Doha. And that is the question of people being stranded on the ground. This is the biggest humanitarian concern. And what happens to the Afghan people? Again, if all these concerned actors were so concerned about what the Afghan nationals would go through, there should have been some actions undertaken well in time to secure their interest. The ANSF, as I said before, say again, the Afghan National Security Force was the least prepared and the least strengthened security force that could stand any grounds against the Taliban. Even during these 20 years, they were not able to stand their ground. They were the least prepared and the least of the forces that could really be a resistance to the Taliban. And the only resistance the Taliban technically faced was in Panjshir, and that too we have seen that after.
Right, Mark, earlier you talked about whether the Taliban have changed from Taliban 1.0 to Taliban 2.0 now. When the Taliban conquered Afghanistan on 15th of August, they announced a general amnesty for everyone. And now, when they conquered the Panjshir Valley, they announced general amnesty for the people of Panjshir. And in today's press conference, Zabiullah Mujahid said that the people of Panjshir are their brothers and they will treat them like their brothers. So isn't this enough for the international community to make of the Taliban that they are changing and they are willing to further change? And you talked about the humanitarian crisis, of course, which the whole world is concerned about. And obviously, the international community plays a very major, important role in taking care of all the mess that has been made in Afghanistan.
Well, I just want to step back, and your points are well taken, but to my distinguished colleague's point, why was it that the United States got involved in Afghanistan? That was because of 9/11. And in the 20 years that the United States was in there, and we can debate till tomorrow if that's a good thing, a bad thing, even Americans are very split on this issue. In those 20 years, there were no attacks on America, and importantly, women were working, women were in universities, there was a civil society. It wasn't perfect. As far as the Afghan security forces are concerned, I would say that when the United States pulled out of Bagram in the middle of the night and pulled out their support and infrastructure, that was kind of pulling the rug under the Afghan security forces. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I think unprecedented in military history, you have this band of the Taliban kind of marching in, walking in to Afghanistan. I don't remember that they had planes. They didn't have tanks. They didn't have artillery. I don't know what they had. I don't know how they did it. They had those machine guns. It's just absolutely extraordinary. And why did it happen? Because the United States domestic politics, to my colleagues here, is the determinant here in Trump and Biden. No more forever wars. We're going to get out of these forever wars. Let's get out of Afghanistan. Now, Americans generally wanted this general policy, but the way it was implemented by Trump to make the deal that he made to release the 5,000 prisoners is now being looked at with horror, and also in retrospect, of course, that's the benefit of retrospect. And Biden's management of the plan of withdrawal was absolutely chaotic, and he left behind Americans and Afghani civilians who helped Americans. And from the American point of view, and 13 dead soldiers, that is something that Americans of all parties, Republican, Democrat, you name it, will not accept, cannot accept, and has undermined Biden's presidency. That's the domestic politics part. On the international politics part, Taliban will not get legitimacy for this, whatever it is they're putting together here, if they don't stop suppressing protests and doing those other things and open up the government, not inclusive on their basis, but make it truly inclusive. And being recognized by a few countries like China and Russia and others is not going to be sufficient to have that recognition. They need to get with the activity of helping their people, and and not creating a state in which, and this is an important point, terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and others will be welcome. And that is America's main red line. And I think this is a red line where, to go back to your original point, Munib, the point is that the United States will not, I don't believe, tolerate the return of these terrorist elements to Afghanistan. So for me, to my heart, I wish the Afghani people a wonderful future. I hope, and all Americans hope, that they have a great future and that the humanitarian crisis can be averted. I think that's kind of the American point of view, but we can't see our way clear to that when we see that Americans are still there stranded, and that our friends who supported the American military are stranded and not being pulled out. If that can be taken care of and they can work through in a way that is going to have rule of law, and not just the rule of law of the Taliban, but the rule of law that we just talked about, which is to have everybody included in a fair and free society, I think they're going to make tremendous strides, and they're going to show us, the world, that what they are capable of doing. And I say that that's a challenge to them to do that. And that would be the good thing for the Afghani people, because that's the major focus, to my mind. What happens to those people? They're wonderful people. What's going to happen to them? Rather than become a pawn in an international chess game. That's not good. let's do the best thing for those people and to work everything out, but let's resolve these issues with the United States and with the West first. I think that's very, very important.
Right, Salma, if you want to respond, you may.
I totally agree with Mark, but tell me one thing. I mean, if the Taliban don't rise to this challenge of what you are suggesting, Afghanistan and the US concept of democracy and many things that you have talked about, the ideals, which are extremely, extremely fascinating, wonderful, and one could really wish that we would fulfill all those ideals, then what would happen? Unfortunately, Mark and Munib, I would actually say that the brunt of failure of these markers would only and only be felt on the Afghan nationals. I really doubt that the US forces that have pulled out after 20 years engagement and so sudden and all of that stuff that has been talked about, they are not going to re-engage in Afghanistan in any capacity, and nor would any other country's forces enter into Afghanistan to get into a deadly fight that has no end. 20 years of US engagement, ISAF engagement, and what do we see happening? Precisely the point that Mark has mentioned here, that the US made a hasty pull-out. Whatever statements they would say, at the end of the day, the US is out of Afghanistan. The international community is out of Afghanistan. All those people, Afghan nationals, who had helped the Western forces are fearful of their life. They're either hiding away or they have already left Afghanistan. So if these challenges and the markers of governance which are being given to the Taliban, and I'm very sorry to say, whether we accept it or not, I'm not passing the buck on to the US for this factor, but the fact that the US in 20 years tried to bring stability, peace, progress, etc., in Afghanistan, when those things did not happen, how can you expect Taliban, who have a very different perspective of governance, to do things that you're asking them to do? And unfortunately, again, I revert back to Doha. Whether we agree or not, they have been given a semblance of legitimacy. The world capitals, including the US, were in direct negotiations with the Taliban after recognizing that they are a stakeholder without whom Afghanistan's picture is not complete, and that for them tantamounts to legitimacy. We can endlessly argue about it, we can endlessly deny this notion, but today not only did they get the political legitimacy by the international actors prior to August 15, 2021, but now that they have the ground to themselves, that also provides them, in their terms, a physical legitimacy. So the situation is very precarious. We can have these democratic debates, but the net result is that the Afghan people have to figure out how to live in these changing circumstances, and no one is going to physically intervene that soon in Afghanistan to help secure Afghan people's interest.
Rightly said by Salma that the Afghans have to take responsibility and they have to build their nation and they have to preserve peace and prosperity, not just in Afghanistan, but also in the neighboring countries, and they have to ensure that. After a break, we'll come back and we shall continue our discussion. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire. I am Munib Hamid, and we have with us Dr. Salma Malik, defense analyst, and Dr. Mark Meirowitz, political analyst. Now, to continue, let me add a statement here. Now, a recent survey was conducted, and which showed divided views on U.S. troops withdrawal. Now, 54% of the U.S. adults said the decision to withdraw troops from Afghanistan was the right one, while 42% say it was the wrong decision. And this was a recent Pew Research Center report showed. Now, Mark, what is the situation in there?
Look, it's American politics, and the question really has been, and I say this very sadly, the factor is how long will the American people remember what happened here? I mean, in fact, about the withdrawal, yes, Americans were in favor of withdrawal in principle, but what went wrong was the way in which it was planned out, and that got Biden very, very low marks and very high negative marks for the way this was done. And of course, Biden said he would not leave any Americans behind. He would not leave any of our Afghani friends behind, and he did. He left them behind and picked August 31st as the deadline, and it's the United States of America. I mean, he wanted out, he pulled out, he believed he could do it, but then he didn't predict that there would be 13 dead soldiers. And if you know that when these parents of these soldiers met and families
there is going to be an attack, Mark.
Yes. Well, there are so many things here that are disturbing about how this occurred and how this was done. And in retrospect, you can always analyze everything. And I do agree with my distinguished colleague in terms of how this is all going to play out. I do agree with that. But from American point of view and analysis, the way it turned out, whether it was predictable or not predictable, and the way it was planned is going to be the linchpin, the key to the future of Biden's presidency. I'm afraid that's really kind of a domestic political consideration. Usually foreign policy is not high on the minds of Americans. We think about COVID, we think about jobs, we think about the economy, but Afghanistan has captured the pictures of the Afghanis falling from the planes that are being evacuated by the United States is a searing image in American political history, and how that occurred and why wasn't it done differently. And this debate is going on. It is a debate that is going to go on and on and on in terms of Biden and his management and his leadership. Now, at the same time, as far as a point about the Taliban, look, I mean, there is a reality, and I recognize the reality, and that's not the point. Nevertheless, as Americans, in the West, right, I mean, we believe in human rights and the sanctity of human rights, and that human rights are not given by governments. They're given by God. They're natural rights. That's what our Declaration of Independence says. There's certain inalienable rights that cannot be taken away. So when we see, as Americans, again, this is our filter. We're not there. We're not in the region. You guys are in the region. We're here in America. We're looking at it from far away. Nevertheless, what we're looking at is we saw women going to school, women working, relatively civil and maybe Western-style society. And now what we see is the possibility that this is going to, not possibility, but probability that this is going to go backwards to, I don't know, some medieval or some Middle Ages idea about how women should be treated. And I don't think this has always been, the Taliban's view has not necessarily always been the way in which the people were treated in the history of Afghanistan. Just to interrupt you there,
Mark, do you not believe, obviously, the US wants to impose its style of living, its culture into a civilization that has no idea about that, and it wants to impose a culture on the people who respect their own culture and they want to live according to their beliefs. And now, you also talked about human rights now by the US, and as it is a policeman of safeguarding the human rights across the world now. Were they preserved in Afghanistan in the 20 years? We saw the US bombing schools, we saw them bombing hospitals, and the only thing we got in back was, I'm sorry, the machine responded negative information. I mean, it's malfunction or something like that. So, Salma, literally, honestly, human rights, were they preserved?
One can be as cynical as possible, but it's bag. In certain instances, there were success stories, but in most of the cases, one would say that this was not happening. At the other hand, I would also say that a lot of hue and cry that was made in the initial instance when the US entered Afghanistan post 9/11, one major agenda was that women in Afghanistan were suffering and they were suppressed. And they were oppressed by the Taliban. But if this was the concern, why was not the civil society strengthened to a point that it can stand on its feet? Today, when we talk about Afghans being responsible for their future and for their fate, do we see Afghan nationals strong enough to stand as a resistance to any of the formidable force that is opposing them? Unfortunately not. There's so many weapons that are circulating in Afghanistan. A majority of those weapons are the ones that were part of the Afghan national security force apparatus, and they were handed over to the Taliban like candy. So when even the security forces are no resistance, how can you expect people to be going out in the street and fighting for their rights? Yes, it has been said that there have been 4 marches by the women protesting the current situation, or the situation how it is unfolded as of 15th August. But the last gathering of women had fires being shot in the air, which was a good warning for them that next time the firing would be on person, not in the air. So that is very much there. So where goes the human rights? And if we are talking so much about the human rights, you see, Munib, the problem is that all of the good picture becomes totally blacked out when such a unceremonious end occurs. We in Pakistan, we are receiving telephone calls, we are receiving desperate texts from many of our Afghan friends who need to secure some kind of refuge either in Pakistan, transit space in Pakistan, or they need to leave for some Western capitals. And this is not something which is happening to me or to one odd people, it is happening to many people, which shows that whatever human rights were maintained during these 20 years, this was a society working in a bubble, and the bubble burst the minute the American or the Western security forces started to desert Afghanistan. And as a result, there is no longer any human rights values that the West is trying to fulfill, or the parameters that they have fulfilled. Now, if the Taliban set the rules as people are criticizing, they're totally justified in doing it. I'm not playing the devil's advocate here, but just see the fact that if the Western world was so empathetic towards the Afghan human rights, then they should have made strong institutions, grassroots institutions that would have stood the test of time, instead of having a political leadership which just ran away at the first sign of trouble. It doesn't happen this way. When you have no alternate leadership helping you, that means that there is no hope for the people. So whatever human rights had been looked into, whatever human rights had been preserved, today that picture no longer exists. It has been totally ripped apart. It's just like the images of music instruments which the musicians are breaking themselves so that no one comes and breaks it on their head and kills them with the strings. People are doing it themselves so that they feel that, okay, we self-destroyed ourselves, and this is a preventive mechanism, some warped psychology that we people have in self-preserving ourselves. So I really doubt that we can now sit comfortably and have a debate on human rights, because the people who are going to replace them, in case they want to respect human rights, they will do it. And for the moment, from the statements that they are passing, it appears that they are going to do it. If they don't, again, they have a free hand. So it's entirely their privilege and purview as to whatever they want to do.
Right, Mark, Salma has made some valid points now, and I'll give you the opportunity to respond if you want to.
No, I'd like to very much. And I very much respect my Dr. Malik, my distinguished colleague's point, but I would say that human rights is not something that's determined by the Taliban. I mean, the UN Human Rights Chief, Michelle Bachelet, has called on the world to deal with the human rights abuses in Afghanistan. This is something that is a right. The right is not because a group comes in. Pol Pot came into Cambodia. The Nazis invaded Europe. I mean, you come in by an invasion. Now, maybe these analogies are not the right analogies, but the point is, if you impose your power on people and then you decide what their human rights are, that goes contrary, at least to the Western view. Now, I do agree with the point that the mission of the United States, again, in retrospect, may have not been very successful. But maybe the things that were mentioned about America's intervention, America's activities, I mean, it's very basic. My little grandson knows this. Two wrongs don't make a right. The Taliban doesn't get a pass because America did something that was maybe not optimal, or in retrospect was not a good policy. You know, the ball, as we say in American sports, is in their court. And are they going to behave in a way where they're going to respect people, or are they going to, as Dr. Malik pointed out, suppress protests by women for their rights? Are women going to get to work? The women, as I understand, at the university in Kabul were told to go home and not come back. Now, I mean, this, from the American point of view, we find this very reprehensible. Now, America's imposition of democracy, it's not up to America to impose democracy. The idea is that freedom is an innate right of every human being. This is ensconced in the American psyche and the American political view. Now, maybe that's a good view or a bad view, and maybe it doesn't take into account the local culture. All of that is true. In many cases, America's intervention did not take into account the culture of the societies, Vietnam, you name it. There have been all kinds of debates about this. But at the end of the day, and especially today, I think it's a little different with social media and, and the media of the world, like Indus News and others, where you're actually talking about this and people are hearing about it and seeing these images of, people falling from planes. I mean, why are they running away? Well, they're afraid. So I think that the Taliban wants to get legitimacy, and I question whether they do. If they want to, they know what they need to do to get the world's legitimacy, to become recognized as a member of the, the Society of Nations, a community of nations. I don't think that the Western countries would want anything other than that. I think that would be great. But if you suppress people, suppress their human rights, and suppress their ability to express themselves, whether that means religion or free expression, freedom, this word is a big word for Americans and for the West. However you define it in your culture, freedom is the right to express yourself and not be imposed upon by a government that tells you what to do, what to think. We see this around the world now. The tendency in this direction is very, very disturbing. So at the end of the day, we want to hope for a great future for Afghanistan, but I don't know how they get across to that great future when, they're not making the steps and taking the steps that are necessary to implement that. If the only thing we can do here is, as you say, an inclusive government, that's fine. Okay, not great, not optimal, but the most important issue is the human rights of the people. That to me is very, very important. And also getting Americans out and getting the Afghani friends of America out of hiding, out, amnesty out, to be rescued and not to face persecution. Those are the, I think, red lines, at least in the American imagination and American thinking.
Right, Salma, you may respond to that. And obviously, is there a different meaning of human rights from the perspective of the United States and the Taliban's perspective?
Well, human rights are human rights. I agree with Mark that there are institutions, supra-institutions that are looking after human rights. But you see, we have seen all along in conflict areas that such aspects, human rights, such values become extremely negotiable. And many a times they are exercised, these norms are exercised when the need happens to be. So I really don't have much hope in a lot of human rights being respected or the West at this particular point reverting back to Afghanistan to go back and address the question of human rights. Yes, they will create a lot of noise about it. There would be a lot of photographs. There would be a lot of imagery on the social media. But having said that, would there be any physical intervention to prevent any human rights abuse? That is something I really, really doubt that is going to happen. Because, again, it's a very logical thing. They just stepped out. Why, if they had to remain there or return, why would have they stepped back? So that factor is there. Again, it is a shot in the dark as to how the Taliban are going to respect the human rights values. We do know that this Taliban setup is despite the fact that many of them did represent were part of the previous Taliban setup or at least the generation. But many of them are new, many of them have interacted with the Western society. They do know that there is a lot of international attention upon them, and they have to tread the path carefully. But having said that, they are very different from what the Western norms are, and their interpretation, their translation of a lot of concepts that the West defines in one sense is going to be very different how the Taliban define it. And that is something that the entire international community has to now understand and live with. Whatever amount of criticism that may be, because they are controlling Afghanistan physically, they have the control, they have the right to call the shots now, whether we like it or not, and no one is going to dissuade them from doing that. No Human Rights Council, if they were so sensitive to the world opinion, the Bamyan Buddhas would have been there where they were. They weren't hurting anyone's human rights, but the very fact is that the Taliban's previous regime, administration, generation, whatever you would like to call them, did what they had to do despite all the public hue and cry and people coming in telling Mullah Omar that don't do this is an international heritage. And they bought them. But the fact is that if today something happens to Afghanistan, how the Taliban are going to interpret the rights, how they're going to interpret what the parameters of the civil society are going to be all about, now they have the physical right in their hand to do so. And we can't do much about it. And this is the very unfortunate writing of it.
And since we are talking about human rights, Salma and Mark, you might agree to this fact that the world chooses which humans do we have to give rights and which humans we are not to give rights. Now, in the closing, I'm just going to say bombing Afghanistan back into the Stone Age was quite a favorite headline for some wobbly liberals. Now, the slogan does all the work, but an instant's thought shows that Afghanistan is being, if anything, bombed out of the Stone Age. This was Newswire. Thank you very much for watching.